Great. Well, that's commendation indeed. And I think we're all still mining Voices of the Poor. So you can see these have got long shelf lives, these pieces of work. OK. You obviously are going to have things you want to react to there, but just bear with us because I want to invite others to have an opportunity to add a comment or a question. So I've seen Kate's hand up over there. So Liam, if you could get the mic to Kate and in the front row.
Hello, Kate Bird, ODI and Chronic Poverty Research Centre. I've got a couple of questions. I found the presentations fascinating and also, well, from the whole panel. But a question about agency, because that floated to the top as one of the key issues that you were discussing in your presentation. I haven't yet read the book, and I look forward to doing that. But I suppose my question is, agency derived from what? Because you seem to separate agency out from economic issues, and you seem to associate agency very strongly with psychology and confidence. So you were conflating with a form of empowerment which is to do with confidence creation. I thought it was very interesting because my empirical work with the Chronic Poverty Research Centre has shown that agency is very strongly associated with asset holdings. So, for example, a woman who has access and control of productive assets has a very different negotiating position within the conjugal contract. Their exit, voice and choice positions are different, associated with their holdings of assets. And I think that, I would believe that to be true of other power relationships within the household and within communities and within broader society and economic functions. So I would say that agency is inherently linked with asset holdings and with economic decision making. And I think that does have, as you said, implications for programming. So I think agency is very important, but I think it's absolutely linked with economic issues. That's one issue. And another issue is about risk. And you were linking risk aversion with the narrative around the sort of voices of Oscar Lewis. And my evidence seems to show a bimodal association with risk aversion, where people with assets, the non-poor, take entrepreneurial risky decisions, whereas people right at the bottom of the wealth profile are also making risky decisions, but in a very different way. They're making survival decisions. So they're not. It's not entrepreneurial in the same way. They're survival decisions and around adverse coping. I've got other points that I'd like to make, but I'll stop there.
Okay, great, thank you. Right down at the front, Leanne. Everybody introduce themselves as they...
Thanks. Ian Buse, Trimplan International UK, formerly DFID. I wanted to ask about the population factor. There was mention, for instance, of farms being downsized as being a factor in, I think, Morocco. But there was, I think, no clear idea of whether the communities had changed during the 10 years in such a way that this has become more of a factor associated with poverty, either one way or the other.
Right. Okay, I've got a few hands, I think, next to Kate first, and then I'll bring into the centre.
Donald Curtis. Just to pick up a point, actually, from Kate. Oscar Lewis, it seemed... If I remember correctly, Oscar Lewis was talking about a situation, and actually a rather long time ago, where people were very land dependent, and land is a zero-sum game. And I think it is others who actually took his ideas and transferred it to rural peasantry as a whole, and not him. But this means that we've got a rather strange model that we're fighting against here, which hasn't actually been related to reality for a long time. And there's no comment in your papers about what is actually a structural transformation in some ways from a land-dependent rural areas to a much more differentiated situation.
Great, thank you. Can I bring us into the centre here? This gentleman here at the front, and then two at the back.
Thank you. My name is Frank Muti. I manage a company that arranges financing for companies and governments in Africa. Very good presentation. I would like the panel to speculate or suggest how we can actually move from where we are now, and I think it's one of the comments that I think it's Duncan referred to, so that we don't have to keep writing more and more books and having more and more research. I mean, what are the steps that should be taken to actually move out of poverty instead of churning out more and more books as we've been doing years and years? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'll be out of a job.
Behind you, I think. Yes, and then we'll bring it over to the centre.
Matt Davis from ATD Fourth World. Thank you very much for the presentation, very interesting. Coming from an NGO, I was quite struck by the pie chart which shows just 0.3% of people were cited as NGOs as being their factor in helping them move out of poverty. And I wonder if you had any knowledge of whether that simply came because of the sparsity of coverage of NGOs, or is it more a question that NGOs are failing to reach those who are living in chronic poverty and are essentially more working with those who have already moved out of poverty?
Great, thank you. And then in the centre here.
Can we respond after that?
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to remember.
Yeah,
all
yeah,
this.
sure. No, no, no. Come on here.
Tom Sanderson. I'm working with a microfinance NGO called Five Talents, and I'm interested in financial education and financial literacy, and how you rate that as a key to improving entrepreneurship and steps to move out of poverty.
Okay, great. All right. On that, Deepa and Nora, would you like to select out a few of those? I mean, one of the threads I think that we picked up from Caroline and Duncan to some extent is you know, where are the kind of structural drivers here in this story, and you know, is there a bit of a missing middle here around the policy conclusions? But there are lots of other things to refer to. So over to you. Maybe 5 minutes each.
Okay, well, why don't you go first, because you can reply on the general critique, and I'll deal with some of the specifics.
Thank you for the excellent comments. And as I said, the study is not perfect, and your comments have certainly picked up on many of the holes. Let me go back to Caroline and both Duncan's comments. I think by the time we got to the conclusions, we ran out of steam. Very simply put. And in a sense, that's I'm being facetious, but there's also some truth to that. What we tried to do is, at the end of each chapter, we tried to have conclusions, and we didn't want to repeat them all over again in the conclusions. And in the conclusions, and the second thing we thought we were very cognizant of is that everything at the end of the day is context specific. And so we took the line of making broad themes rather than coming down and repeating what we'd already said in the chapters. But I take your point that there really is a need to look more concretely and pull together those thoughts in terms of what to do about it, which is also the question that you raised, and I'll come back to that. I think one weakness in our study is one area where we did not go into depth absolutely is on gender relations. And the reason we didn't do that, it was so complicated already to try and make sense of the 100,000 pages and try to get a story around moving out of poverty. And then if we went into gender issues, we had to look at what women said, what men said, and how it links to everything else. We just didn't feel we could do a good job. So I think once the data is made available, that's a very rich data set for others to look at those, probe those issues in depth. And we decided that given our time framework, we couldn't do it justice. So we mentioned it where we could, but we have not done justice to it at all. So you're absolutely right in that. Some of the surprises of the study, I think there's also, I completely take your point on structural issues. Actually, they do come up a lot, and we tried to address it in each chapter, but then we didn't bring it up again in the conclusions. You're absolutely right. I think in terms of how you ask the methodological issues that you hinted at, how you ask a question determines the answer. Right? That's absolutely the case, which is why we had 10 different data collection techniques, and we tried to look at the same issue in different ways and then piece it together. And I think we've done a reasonable job of it. So the issues on discrimination, be it on gender or be it on ethnicity, etc., actually do come up came up in every discussion. One of the issues, and maybe we made the wrong decision, but one of the decisions we made very early on is how to deal with social inequality. And we had endless debates on whether it should be in a separate chapter or should be the theme through which, or the lens through which you look at each chapter. And we decided to do it in each chapter, and clearly haven't done it justice. So that's sort of my general response. Role of religion. It may be a result of our sampling. So, for example, in Latin America, you have to remember this is a limited number of communities. In Latin America, for example, we just went to indigenous communities in Mexico, and we had urban communities in Colombia. In fact, in Voices of the Poor, role of religious organizations came up much more strongly than it has this time, and I think that's an artifact of our sampling strategy. Migration, I was surprised. It comes up very strongly in some areas, in some contexts, like in Morocco as well as in Mexico. In other areas, it's much more internal migration and circular movement, so we catch that. But if you look at the actual numbers, I was very surprised. Even in India, it's about 2%. I don't know why that is, but the range everywhere is between 2 to 3, except in Mexico and in a sample in Mexico and in Morocco. And that's a bit of a puzzle, but I think it's people talk about, so it does reflect in remittances, but the numbers we got are lower than one would expect. I thought your question was, Kate, your question and your articulation is absolutely brilliant. I think I agree completely with what you said in terms of risk. We don't mean to say that the poor are risk averse. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. In fact, you'll find some numbers in the book where we show that exactly in the way you said, that poor people take risks, but it's constrained by the resources they have. In fact, we have a wonderful table that I personally love that shows that because of the absence of assets, poor people can't invest in technology and new assets. They substitute it through hard work. And so the kinds of initiatives they take are limited and different from those of the better off. So you're absolutely right on the second point you made is, I think one needs to look at agency in 2 steps. The way we've reported it is agency, if you think of an equation, agency as an input, or what is the relationship with agency and moving out of poverty. That's one part. The second part is, if agency is important, then what are the determinants of agency, right? In terms of determinants of agency, yes, assets becomes very important. And we have those, the numbers on that is in the book. In fact, in most contexts, assets become very important in supporting personal agency.
One more point, Deepa, and then we'll bring in.
Okay. What do you do with all this? And no more books, I agree. I support you completely on that. I think the main, I think in terms of moving out of poverty, it is how do you support poor people's entrepreneurship? Poor people are not lazy, they're taking lots of initiatives. These initiatives fail, they are limited, everyone starts producing the same thing, and their markets get saturated very quickly. So it's very simply, how do you support poor people's entrepreneurship so that it's sustainable, it's something for which they get fair prices in the markets, it gets aggregated so that their bargaining power shifts. I think that's the main thing. And the second big thing would be to make basic services work. And out of those, I would say roads is very important. Roads and physical markets really change what's happening, and people get encouraged and start going to markets and the regulations around it.
Thank you. Want to make a few comments?
I'll
Bring
make-
the mic round.
Keep in mind with all of these that if the numbers seem odd, for example, in migration, that from each country we're drawing from a pretty limited sample, and depending on the question that drove the sampling, certain things might be very underrepresented. migration might be one of that. I also had a comment on the issue of the link between agency and asset holding, which I think is very true, and especially if one broadens the notion of assets to include psychological assets, things like education, because certainly we found that while education didn't necessarily make for economic success, it did often make people more confident about trying something. Getting an income for women, even a small income, made a big difference in their confidence within the household. And then in Andhra Pradesh, where the study looked at the impact of self-help groups, the participation in a self-help group, especially those groups that were federated, was a very important social asset that gave women a lot more voice, both within the household and within the community. There was a question about had communities changed over 10 years. There are two interesting points there. One is that the study, because it's retrospective, it doesn't include households that moved out of the community and that maybe really prospered, so it might even underrepresent the degree of moving out of poverty. In Morocco, communities had changed a lot. Especially the rural, the very isolated communities, because anybody who could migrate did migrate, often internally. So the people who were left were women, elderly, small children, and the communities were not doing well. Well, they diminished, they shrunk. And then again, the what to do. I think one of the big messages of the book is about vulnerability. And that whole group of people who are just above or even somewhat comfortably above the poverty line, but can very easily become impoverished. I mean, we're seeing this now all around the world. And you see it in relation to health shocks, that anyone who's doing well, if they have a catastrophic illness in a country without health insurance, that's it. So I think one of the big issues is how to provide social protection, how to provide health coverage that's available for everyone, in addition to markets and opportunities.
Great. Okay. We literally have 5 minutes left, but if there is anyone on a burning question, yes, just over here. I'll just take a couple and get some very, very quick reactions from everyone at the end.
Thanks. It's Mike Jennings from the Development Studies Department at SOAS. Just to follow up something that Duncan raised, Voices of the Poor has some quite interesting things to say about faith institutions, and I just wondered if there was anything that can be added in this context.
Yes, you were at the end, and then over there. And I'll come quickly back to you. Very short comments now, please.
Thank you. Tim Marchant, retired from the World Bank, a statistician basically steeped in poverty analysis from the quantitative side. I'm very interested to know what has changed, and I think we skated over some of the methodological issues a little bit in today's presentation. What has changed over the last 10 years in terms of methodology? A couple of points. The first one was the use of the definition of poverty. I was very interested and excited by the fact that you're using a community or an individually defined definition of poverty rather than an objective one such as the standard moneymetric measurements, which I think are so fraught with measurement problems that I'm not sure that when we use those we even know whether poverty is going up or down. But on the qualitative side, I'm also quite worried about the fact that there's very little discussion of sampling. And as a statistician, I'm quite concerned that a lot of these statistics and percentages that have been presented are really not justifiable without some more discussion on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Just the guy in the jumper there, and then I'll bring it in for a couple. Why you all leave it to the last 5 minutes? Go ahead.
I have to say, first, I haven't read the book, so this is entirely based on the presentations that have just been given. But you talk a lot about moving in and out of poverty in a time frame that seems fairly large. And I wanted to ask, what about sort of intra-year changes, like issues of seasonality in healthcare and food security, and whether these got revealed at all within the participatory study?
Okay. So we've got sampling, we've got intra-year. there's two women here, and then you at the back there, and you there, and then that's it. I'm closing it then. And then you might be able to grab Deepa at the end if you want to.
I'm Rika Garde from Save the Children. I was just wondering if the ladder of life approach, could it inform the way national household income surveys are done, wherein there's a set category wherein you try to fit people whether they're poor or not, and then which later inform national anti-poverty strategies? Or is that, if trying to merge the two, is that a bad marriage?
Okay, over here, and then the two gentlemen.
Thanks. Rosalie Corway from the LGA. I was interested in terms of the recommendations you've come out with. Really, it's a request that you focus on at the institutional level and looking at local governments and saying, you know, if we're talking about supporting entrepreneurship of SMEs and at the individual level, local authorities can and should be stimulating that through training and enabling and through facilitating access to finance and so on. And it's not just about basic service provision, it's about social service support and so on. And how can we be enabling local government to be taking that role more effectively and looking at things at the national level, including working through local government associations who provide that sort of training and strengthening of local government. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can you pass it along? Okay, you at the back and then forward.
John Barnes from Panos, which is a media and communication NGO working on development issues. Thank you very much for the presentations and also for the commentaries. I thought it was all very, very interesting. A question I just wanted to ask whether the extent, I've not read the report, so the extent to which there's information analysis of how poor people feel about how they're seen and represented publicly. It was quite noteworthy that all the presentations and speakers identified that poverty is not an identity, it's a situation, subject to structural factors. So I think that question of public attitudes is possibly one that needs to be explored further. Also in terms of poor people's communication power, in terms of affecting how that public discourse is created, but perhaps how that public discourse is created, perhaps that might be an issue for further research in itself.
Okay, very good. And last one.
Anthony Ellman, Natural Resources Institute. Just following up on the the no more books question and a possible mechanism for moving from concepts to action. Many of the issues which you raised, Deepa, are addressed by fair trade partnerships, access to markets, better prices, democratic decision-making, and also community action for building up infrastructure. So I wonder whether there was a sufficient number of people in your sample in any countries participating in fair trade initiatives, and whether they saw these as more beneficial than they seem to have seen NGO actions.
Okay, very good, thank you. Just a couple of those, and maybe you'd be willing just to sort of talk to a few people afterwards.
I'll be happy to talk with you during the break if you're still here. Local government role in supporting entrepreneurship, we have quite a bit of focus on this, that this is actually very important, because with an expanded pie, there's less, we have some numbers on this, with an expanded pie, there's less grabbing of resources or misuse of resources. In terms of the fair trade, we didn't actually have people discussing it directly, but in terms of our recommendations, we say what is important is changing business cycles and how businesses are conducted. So there are greater movement towards corporations of the poor, and poor people getting a fairer share in the value chain. So they move higher up on the value chain. I think the last thing I want to say is on NGOs. What you hinted at is right. I didn't pick that up earlier. That it's both an issue of coverage, it's also what NGOs do, and also how effective they are. So a lot of the NGO work which focuses on social issues is very important, but it may not feed directly into moving out of poverty.
Yeah, just this question of changes within the 10 years in terms of poverty seasonality. I don't think we picked up so much on seasonality, but I think poverty does go up and down in response to life cycle changes as well. So I think we see a lot of that as families, young people separate from their families, may experience a period of poverty, established families are poor while their children are young, and then become more prosperous when they send their children out to work or out abroad to send remittances. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I think this has been an incredibly rich and fascinating presentation and discussion today with some really terrific issues on the table. I think, Deepa, probably if I pick up the pulse, there probably should be another book. And maybe you need to start cooking it now, because it seems that there is a sense of an unfinished project here. And, you know, there is a whole rich seam of issues to begin to mine around perhaps the scope and limits of public policy, taking up from where you've left off in this book. But we want to thank you very much, both of you, Nora and Deepa, very much indeed, to Caroline and Duncan for some very challenging and insightful comments, and to all of you, many thanks.